Guys, so out in the garden now, and let's go into the craziness that is my garden. Squash. So I have both of the main types. You're going to have the two main types being, I guess I should tell you that first. There's what we call a summer squash and what we call a winter squash. The main difference is in the time that you're going to harvest them. So winter squash, you're typically going to leave them until they have fully matured. So you're going to pick those at the end of the harvest time, so around like September, October. Summer squash, you're typically going to harvest them when they're not mature yet. So that's going to be things like zucchini, or also the white scallop squash that I'm growing. And the reason that you pick summer squash early is because we eat them, they tend to have a softer skin, they don't last as long, they don't store for as long as some of the winter squashes do, and that's just because we're picking them before they're fully ripe. So they are going to, you can pierce their skin easily with a thumbnail, where when you're checking for the ripeness of a winter squash, you want to just gently kind of put your nail in. Your nail shouldn't go in easily, and that'll tell you when it's ready to harvest. So a winter squash variety is spaghetti squash. I have some of those. I'll show you those in a minute. Another one is acorn squash, which I'm also growing. For my summer squash, the only two I have are the zucchinis, but I have 4 different types of zucchinis. And the other one that I have is, yes, the white scallop squash. So, let me show you my squash. So this is my Hori Hori garden knife. I love it. So hang on a second. So it has the measurements on it, so you can use it for depth. It's also got a serrated edge and a flat edge, but it's got a little bit of a curve to it as well, so you can use it for digging. It's pretty much an amazing all-round garden tool. So let's see if we can get in here and very carefully harvest this. Now, anytime you're taking out the squash, just generally a good thing to do is to always keep it with the longest stem you can on it. This is especially important for the winter squash, not as much for the summer squash, because you're typically going to eat them. But from a storage perspective, you always want the longest stem you can on it. That even goes for pumpkins. So especially if you're buying your pumpkins early, you're going to want to grab one that has the longest stem possible. So there we go. I'm a little obsessed with these white scallop squash. They have a great history as with a lot of heirloom seeds that go back. These ones, I think, go back to the 1500s, tracing back to the Native Americans that saved the seeds, which is kind of crazy to think that this squash that I grew came from seeds that have just been saved generation over generation. And now I can save seeds from it and kind of keep this line going. I was mentioning the acorn squash. That is a trailing squash. So it is going to go, this is still the exact same plant. It goes all the way along, and it goes somewhere back there into the mess in amongst the zucchini. So one thing that's important to know with these is as they trail along the ground, they're going to root. So this thing doesn't want to move. It's rooted in there, so it can continue growing even if something gets damaged further closer to where you originally planted it. So when I water these, I tend to kind of water all along. It's probably rooted along there on the ground. Next year I do want to try some of these on. I'm going to do a cattle panel trellis that I'm going to have kind of going over and in between the beds, because it definitely is harder to keep it controlled when it's growing all over the place. Like this was started over in the back corner, and now it's grown all the way along the length of my 12-foot bed. I'm also thinking that the arched panels will make it easier for doing the hand pollination, because it'll be easier to see the flowers, also easier to see the fruit, and kind of keep things under control. And over on this side now, we have the winter squash, or another one, which is my spaghetti squash. So there's one there, There's another one over there. Okay, so it's morning. I'm out in the garden. It's already incredibly hot, but this is the best time if you're going to come out and do some hand pollination of your squash. Now is the time to do it. This is when the blossoms are open and you're going to have the best chance. That said, you should be doing this every single day. It's not a set it and forget it thing. You don't get to just come out once and hope that they take. I mean, you don't have to come out at all, but if you want to increase your chances of having a lot of squash, then you're going to want to do it every single morning. And that's because it can take up to 12 visits from a pollinator from a female fruit to actually get pollinated properly. So if you want to do your best to help it along, do it every morning. Okay, so let's go and take a look and see what flowers I have. It's important that you know that there are both male and female flowers on a squash plant, and they are not all open at the same time. They open sequentially, which means that you could have all male flowers open today and tomorrow have a female flower and no male flowers. So that's why it's always good to have more than one of any type of plant in your garden if you have enough space, because it's going to increase your chance of things getting pollinated properly. So there's lots of different types of pollinators. Typically, everybody thinks of bees, and they're probably one of the best ones that you want to have. And bees are so incredibly important. Without them, a lot of our food supply would just disappear. So it's important to give them food as well and give them what they need. One of my favorite ways to bring bees to the garden is to use my sunflowers. I have a couple right now. They're big. I've just planted some more because I just want more. So let's take a look at my sunflowers. They are absolutely massive. Like, they're just huge. And they get bigger as it goes up. This one is a mammoth gray. The head on this one will be about 1 foot, and it grows about 10 feet tall. I think it's probably at about that height now. Okay, so we talked about pollinators. So now we need to know what we're pollinating. So as I mentioned, there's going to be male flowers and female flowers. And there's a very easy way to tell them apart. The male flowers, they're typically going to bloom first. They're going to be the first ones that you see. They're also the ones that if you want to eat the flowers, because they are edible, a lot of people will pick them and stuff them and then dip them in batter. I haven't done it yet, but it's supposed to be delicious. But the male ones are the ones you're going to want to use for that. They're going to typically have really long stems, so that's an easy way to identify them. They get further from the plant than the female ones do. So, and there tends to be a lot more of them. As I mentioned earlier, they open up sequentially, so the more that you have of any one type, the more chance that you're going to have for proper pollination. And the female flowers, how you identify those is they're going to have an embryonic version of the fruit at their stem. That's there, and then assuming it's basically acting like the ovary. So if they get pollinated, then the flower will shrivel up and the plant or the fruit will continue to grow. If they don't, then you'll see the fruit start to, the tip of it tends to go yellow, and then it'll start to shrivel up. And at that point you can go and using a clean and really sharp knife or like a hoary garden blade, you can use one of those and you're going to want to cut it off. The reason for that is otherwise it's going to rot and it can cause other problems for you on the vine, and we want to avoid that because we want to give it more chances to have more fruit so that we can have more squash because they're delicious. So I have a female acorn squash out here that I was out hand pollinating the other day. Hopefully the bees have been in there too, and I've got a good chance that it is taken. I'll keep an eye on it for the next few days and see if it starts to yellow. If it does, I'll remove it and then hope for another fruit. So let me show you the difference of the two types of flowers in it. That one, so the fruit we were looking at before, the bee in it, that is a male plant. So you can see it's got a really long stem, and inside that's what the pollen is going to be in there. So some people will rip off the plant. I can show you on this one. So they'll take off the male flower like this, and then, give me a second here, they will rip off all the petals so that they've exposed the inside of the male flower like this. And then they'll take this and they'll use this almost like a paintbrush to go into the female plant and to pollinate it. Now this is not what I do. I like to use a really fine paintbrush. I'll show you in a second. And I use that because now this is no good for any pollinators. If I had left it on the plant with the bloom, I can take a little bit of the pollen and use that to try and pollinate the female flowers, but I'm also leaving the pollen there for the bees, so they have an opportunity to come get it, to take it back to make honey, or to help pollinate my squash or my neighbor's squash, because she has some as well. Okay, so this is my paintbrush. I just got it on Amazon. It's got a very soft tip, so it's not going to damage anything. And then all we're going to want to do is, I think I saw a flower over here. Oh, that one's occupied. We have another bee in there, so we'll leave him alone. We'll see if we can find another flower with no bees. All right. Oh, no, that's got a bee in it too. Well, this is a good sign. I've also got another one of my white scallop squash in here. That's going to be ready for harvest soon. Okay, so while we wait for those flowers to get freed up because the bees are still in them, let's take a quick look at the female flower. So here's one. This is the one I was pollinating the other day. So the flower's already dried up, so if it's going to be pollinated, that would have happened, so I'll have to wait and see if this turns yellow. You can see they tend to be, the female flowers are much closer to the stem on the trailing types of squash, or very close to the base on a non-trailing type like zucchini or even a white scallop squash. So if this is not pollinated, the tip here will start to go yellow in a few days. If the pollination did take, then we will end up with a fertilized squash like this other acorn squash I have over here. This is a winter squash, so we're not going to harvest it until we can stick our nail in and it doesn't leave much of a mark. I can see that left a mark there, so we'll give this a little bit longer. The female part, where we're going to put the pollen from the male, is called the pistil. So we carefully just take a little bit of pollen, just going to very gently brush it on so that we know that that flower is going to be for sure pollinated. Now you see I have lots of flowers on here at the moment, but out of all of them, there's only one female. So that's why it's beneficial to have more than one of a specific type of plant, so that if you have a lot of male plants open, or male flowers open on one plant, and there's a female plant somewhere else, that you'll have enough pollen, or the bees have a chance to pollinate it. So another thing that you can do to help with pollination, and some people are going to say don't do this, so I'll just give you the information and you can decide what's best for you. It doesn't really apply to the trailing squash. One of the best things you can do for them is really grow them vertically, and that will make it easier for you to find the fruit, to do the pollination, and then the fertilized fruit will hang down, and it's easier just to take care of them. But what you can do for squash that doesn't trail, such as a zucchini or my white scallop squash, among other ones, is you can trim some of the leaves. Because the leaves are hollow, some people say that this can cause extra disease if water gets in them. I have trimmed my long squash leaves, especially if there's some powdery mildew, and also to help give more access to the fruit. I haven't had a problem. That doesn't mean that where you are, if the climate is different, or even just the squash plant is different, that it may not cause issues. So it's something that you need to really think about before you do it. So I do like to go in and trim out some of the zucchini leaves specifically, because it allows for better access to the flowers, because the leaves are tall and they kind of make a whole dome over the flower or over the plant, and it can be harder, not impossible, but it can be harder for the pollinators to get in. So I just like to clean it up a bit to give a bit more access and to allow for more airflow in between, to hopefully kind of keep that powdery mildew at bay. So it's something you can do at your own risk, because it may cause issues on your plant. But if you have more than one plant, it may be something to give it a try. I'm always one for trying something and to try and conduct little experiments, I guess, garden experiments. But I'll do something on one plant and not on the other to see if there's a difference, to see if one way is better, because one thing, if nothing else, that I've learned from gardening is that it is continually a learning experience. I learned stuff last year and I didn't make those same mistakes again, but I've made new ones this year. And so I'll do it a little bit differently next year. So it is definitely a continual learning experience. So it's not about it being perfect, it's about learning year over year and finding out what works best for you, because each garden is different. You might be in a different zone than somebody else, so something that works for them is not going to work for you. And even within your own garden, you have to figure out what the microclimates are, what is best to plant. in a certain microclimate versus another, and also what microclimates do you create in the way that you plant your plants or plant your vegetables. But I will talk more about microclimates on another vlog.